On the night of October 9, 1963, one of the tallest dams in the world stood in a narrow valley in northern Italy. Minutes later, Longarone and nearby settlements below it had been devastated, and 917 people were dead. Yet the concrete arch of the Vajont Dam had not collapsed. The catastrophe came from the mountain beside its reservoir. Roughly 270 million cubic meters of rock slid into the water, displaced an enormous wave, and sent part of that water over the crest. The reversal matters. Engineers built a structure strong enough to survive forces that the landscape around it could not safely contain. The Vajont Valley lies where steep alpine slopes close around a tributary of the Piave River. Italy's post-war economy demanded electricity, and hydroelectric development promised power from mountain water. The dam rose more than 260 meters above its foundation, creating a reservoir intended to connect with the wider Cador system and feed the Soverzine power station. As a piece of concrete engineering, the thin double curvature arch was extraordinary, but a reservoir is never only a wall. It is also water pressure, rock structure, groundwater, old landslide surfaces, changing shorelines, and communities living above and below the basin. Construction began during the 1950s. The project was developed by the private electricity company SAID before Italy's electricity industry was nationalized and the system transferred to Enel. Geological investigation did occur, but the interpretation of the slope evolved while construction and reservoir testing continued. Later studies concluded that the mass involved in 1963 followed an ancient landslide structure on Monte Toc. The mountain was not a simple solid block. Layers, folds, clay-rich seams, and groundwater created a failure system whose behavior could change as the reservoir rose and fell. Warnings were not limited to theory. In 1959, a landslide at the nearby Ponte Reservoir generated a wave and killed a worker. At Vajont, cracks and movements on Monte Toc became increasingly important. On November 4, 1960, about 700,000 cubic meters of material slid into the reservoir when the water level was near 650 meters above sea level. The resulting wave was contained, but the event proved that part of the slope was already moving. Engineers could no longer ask whether a landslide was possible. They had to estimate its size, speed, and the wave it might create. A bypass tunnel was constructed so water could move between the separated parts of the reservoir if a larger slide blocked the valley. Models were also used to study waves. These measures show that the hazard was recognized, but recognition is not the same as a safe prediction. The assumed slide behavior was slower and more manageable than the final event. Physical models depend on the input chosen for volume, velocity, water level, and geometry. If the real mountain moves faster than the scenario, the resulting wave can be radically larger. Reservoir level became a control lever. As water rose, it entered fractures and changed pressure conditions inside the slope. Drawdown could also matter because external water support fell, while pore pressures within the rock mass did not necessarily decline at the same rate. Operators raised and lowered the lake in attempts to understand or reduce movement. Observations showed a relationship between water level and slope velocity, but the system was not a simple switch. It contained delayed responses and an unstable failure surface, whose friction could degrade as movement accelerated. By 1963, the reservoir had been raised above 700 meters. Movement on Monte Toc accelerated. In late September and early October, measurements increased from millimeters toward centimeters per day, then faster. The lake was being lowered, but the rate of the mountain's movement continued to rise. Modern analyses have shown that accelerating displacement can contain warning information, yet forecasts remain sensitive to the physical model and the data available. What was visible in 1963 was already enough to establish that the slope was not stable. Communities around the reservoir received restrictions and evacuations in exposed areas, but Longarone lay downstream beyond the dam. The dominant expectation was that the concrete barrier would contain the reservoir or that a predicted wave would remain within estimated limits. That framing placed attention on the strength of the dam and the immediate lake shore. The real disaster path was different. A fast slide would push water upward and outward, send one surge against the opposite slope, strike settlements around the basin, and drive another mass over the dam into the narrow gorge leading to Longarone. At about 10:39 p.m. local time on October 9, the northern face of Monte Toc failed. The rock mass, commonly estimated around 270 million cubic meters, entered the reservoir in less than a minute. Scientific estimates of exact velocity vary, and responsible reconstruction should not pretend that one number is certain. What is secure is that the slide was far faster than the manageable scenario. The displaced water had nowhere to spread across a broad lake. The narrow valley converted the impact into rapidly rising surges. One wave ran up the opposite slope to extraordinary height. Other water struck Urdo, Casso, and settlements along the reservoir. About 50 million cubic meters are officially described as overtopping the dam and rushing toward the Paia Valley. The dam's crest was crossed, but the arch itself remained standing. That survival can mislead photographs taken afterward. The intact wall looks like evidence that the engineering system worked. In reality, the system included the reservoir and slope, and the fatal energy had passed over the structure rather than through a structural breach. Below the crest, water dropped into the narrow Vajont gorge, carrying air, debris, and enormous momentum. Longarone sat where the gorge opened toward the Paia. The destructive flow arrived with little usable warning and erased much of the town. Official Italian civil protection records 917 deaths, including hundreds of people whose bodies were never recovered. The scale demands restraint. This was not a spectacle created by a collapsing dam. It was a human disaster produced by a chain of geological behavior, technical assumptions, operational decisions, and inadequate protection. The phrase dam disaster therefore hides the central mechanism. A dam failure normally suggests that a wall cracks, overtops through flood, or loses structural integrity. Vajont showed another category. The wall can survive while the impounded water becomes the weapon. Engineers today treat reservoir-induced slope hazards, displacement waves, and run-up as part of system safety. The lesson extends beyond dams. Any project that changes groundwater, loading, or erosion can activate processes outside the structure that designers believe they are controlling. Afterward, investigations, trials, and public debate examined responsibility. The disaster became a national symbol of ignored warnings and institutional failure. Legal conclusions developed over years, while scientific work continued to refine the geological model. It is important not to reduce every decision to a cartoon of people who knew the exact future. They did not know the precise final velocity or wave. The failure was that uncertainty and observed acceleration did not produce protection proportional to the possible consequence. The reservoir was never returned to its intended use. The landslide mass remains in the valley, and the dam still stands below it. That landscape is the most direct diagram of the event: concrete on one side, a displaced mountain on the other, and an emptied space where engineers once expected controllable water. The preserved structure has also become a place of memory. Its survival should not be celebrated without remembering why nearly 2,000 people below it did not survive. Vajont changed the way catastrophic risk is explained because it demonstrates that strength in one component cannot compensate for blindness elsewhere. The dam resisted the load for which its concrete form was designed. The mountain failed along an ancient surface. The water transmitted that failure beyond the reservoir. Models underestimated speed. Operational control did not stop acceleration. Emergency planning did not protect the entire consequence zone. Every statement can be true at the same time. The strongest image from Vajont is not a broken wall. It is the intact dam after the wave. That image destroys the comforting idea that a project is safe when its most visible component remains sound. Systems fail through connections: rock to water, water to structure, structure to valley, measurements to decisions, and decisions to people. On October 9, 1963, the concrete survived. The assumptions around it did not.